Am I on? All right, good. So, by a show of hands, how many people feel like they're not doing enough with their fitness routine? That's a lot. Who feels totally content with your fitness routine, like you're at where you want to be, you don't need any change? Okay, that's a good number too. So you guys can read a book or whatever for the next little bit. So my goal for you by the end of this talk is to give you some, I think, important questions you can ask and some perspectives you can take when you're evaluating what you want to do and what suggestions you may hear from other people. And also, hopefully I can give you a stronger directional sense of where the good stuff is when you're trying to select exercise activities. So a little bit about my perspective. I think that all activity is not equal as exercise. Definitely some kinds of activity will be far more valuable than others. And second, I think it's really easy to make errors of implementation. Even if you feel like you see where the value lies, when the rubber meets the road, it's easy to do things that, if you've got a trajectory, you're either going orthogonal to that or completely counter to that and not even realizing that. So those are in some of the pitfalls I'm going to bring up in the second part of the talk. A little background on the basic idea of exercise. Many people credit the dawn of real exercise science with around 1950, when there were some interesting studies of the London transportation system. And a discovery was that the conductors on double-decker buses had vastly lower rates and severity of heart disease than the drivers. And they worked to try to factor out their age and their weight and diet and all these other factors, and basically concluded that it had to be that the conductors were walking up and down in the double-decker buses all day and the drivers are sitting there. The higher level of activity seemed to yield benefits. And they reproduced these studies looking at postal workers and over and over again. And that's a trend that has seemed to really hold as we've gotten more precise with the scientific instruments of studying those criteria. So that's a beginning. So there's something worth thinking about here. And I want to also clarify, what do we mean then by exercise? So imagine you go out to work on your lawn and you spend hours digging and moving heavy things around, and at the end of that, you're feeling tired and you're winded a little bit, your muscles are sore and tired. You might be tempted to say, boy, that was good exercise. That's kind of in common parlance what people would say. But from my perspective, that was activity. And it might have gotten you a lot of the benefits we're going to be trying to get, but there is a kind of activity that's selected for the sole purpose of deriving physical benefits, where that's our standard, that's our criteria, and that's how we're choosing what we're doing. And we need a term for that, and that term is exercise. So if we think of a person who's an outdoorsman, who lives in a log cabin, who does all kinds of strenuous activity every day, that person may be getting all of the benefits his body could generate from exercise. He may not need to do it, he may not benefit from doing exercise, but I wouldn't say that he's doing enough exercise. For him, I would say he's not doing exercise and he's not going to benefit from it. So I think that's an important distinction to make. And also, I can talk about sports. So when somebody works to get faster, go higher, further, longer in a sporting event, what they do is something we call training. No, we don't call what they do exercise, and I think there's a good reason for that, because a lot of performance is skill-based. It's using the strength you have to go faster, farther, longer, in a better way, in a more effective way, in a more efficient way sometimes. And it may result in added strength, but certain things will actually be harmful in the long run or be harmful to strength that will cause improvements in performance. So it's really problematic to look at athletes and to look at performance and think that's exercise. And I can go into that a lot more in the Q&A if you have questions. So again, when I talk about exercise now, I'm talking about deliberate activity done for the purpose of stimulating physical improvements. So I'll move on to mention some of the benefits of activity, that reasons why we would want to exercise. Strength of the muscles, so you can produce more force. Strength of the muscles and tendons to resist injury and recover from injury. Stamina, bone density, joint integrity and strength, balance, insulin sensitivity and glucose disposal. Muscle size is one a lot of people really focus on. Some people will express that, some people won't. And it's my perspective that someone who adds a lot of muscle size with exercise is actually not responding as well as someone who doesn't. Ask me in the Q&A if you want more about that. Lowering osteoarthritis pain can occur. Reducing risk of cardiovascular disease, which I already mentioned, but also diabetes. There's some interesting information on cancer as well. And changes in gene expressions from, I think now, hundreds of genes that tend to change in their expression as we age, that can be reversed with exercise in many instances. And all those things can create an improved enjoyment of daily activities, of recreational activities, of sporting activities, and those are real values. So those are the kind of standards of how I think we judge how well an activity functions as exercise. And those can be tricky to measure. And how we arrive at believing that those are the standards and those are affected is something that's very interesting to me. I don't want to jump in too much to that now, but ask me in the Q&A and I can talk about that a little bit. Now, the downsides to physical activity. So physical activity doesn't only confer benefits, it can harm us. And if we push any mechanical system to the absolute limit of what it can do, we know that can create long-term gradual deterioration at a faster rate, and it can create a catastrophic sudden event. And the same is true of exercise with our bodies. So think about if you decided to take your car, put your car on the racetrack, and try to optimize the engine of your car to go as fast as it could possibly go around that racetrack. How do you think that's going to impact your ability to use your car as a daily driver? Is it going to improve it? Probably not. And we know the same thing happens with these extreme ultra-endurance athletes with their bodies. So again, be wary of looking at people who excel in athletics and look like they're amazingly fit and do these incredible things, which I think it's amazing what some people can do, but that's not necessarily the way to longevity or even quality of life. Some of those people have a rough time even currently in their issues with joint pains and all kinds of stuff. So a challenge of exercise then is to yield significant net benefits, where we have a minimal downside risk of acute injuries and long-range gradual deterioration. So that leads me into the first principle that I want to cover. I put this first for a reason. It's safety. The big question I always ask is there a safer way that I can get equal or better outcomes to something I'm doing? So if we're engaging in deliberate activity for the purpose of stimulating improvements, I think it makes sense to eliminate any unnecessary risks that might push us to the opposite outcome. It's kind of like the rule of investing that says the first rule is don't lose money. And I think the second rule is to not forget the first rule. I think it was either Charlie Munger or Warren Buffett who said that. Except there's more here, because in investing, if you lose $1,000, you can learn from that and go back and make $1,000, and that $1,000 you make is going to function equally well. $1,000 is $1,000. But if we injure ourselves in exercise, we can cause a chronic, maybe lifelong problem that we can mitigate, but we may never get around. And you probably know people who have for 20 or 40 years had some injury they got in a sport, and it's just never gone away, and it's caused deterioration in their quality of life. So if our purpose is exercise, we want to limit that. Now, it's not possible to eliminate all risk of injury, and I think the risk of injury is much higher from not exercising. But where it's practical and reasonable, I always, for myself, choose the path of lower injury risk. So this can involve some understanding of the movements you're doing, the biomechanics, what's happening in your joints, some physics about how the forces are going to respond in moment arms, and it can get really technical, but it can also be basic things like, is there a possibility if I'm trying to jump up onto this platform and back down that I could slip, and if I slip, what's going to happen? Or if I'm doing something with a weight, if I get tired, is there a possibility I'm going to drop it on my foot? So basic things like that are often not observed. Who here has seen some of the YouTube videos of exercise bloopers that are out there? So it's not everybody. If you haven't, these videos come out constantly. People are filming other people in gyms doing the craziest things, and it's painful because these people have bad accidents. But you can take a look at some of that to see what not to do in your approach. Okay, next principle is intensity, what I consider the heart of exercise, and in many ways it's almost synonymous with the idea of exercise. So again, the trend in the data is that efforts that are more intense are going to yield better outcomes across most all of these factors that exercise can improve that I mentioned. And there are interesting mechanisms of muscle function that give us insight into what that means at the cellular and molecular levels. So we have an idea of how to target intensity, what that means, not only from watching this general, okay, these bus conductors are more active than the people who are sedentary, maybe people who are lifting weights are getting more benefit from the bus conductors, but really what are the dimensions of intensity we're going after? So I think this is fascinating stuff. I'll try to go through it quickly, but I think it's valuable to understand that a muscle tissue, like say in my upper arm, the muscle that's going to actively shorten and cause my elbow joint to flex, it has in it muscle fibers that individually shorten, and it has a whole variety of these muscle fibers. Some of them don't fatigue at all, and they don't produce very much force, but if I'm standing, I can use these low force producing muscle fibers to keep standing indefinitely, and eventually I might collapse out of general fatigue and the fact that I haven't slept for a long time and maybe haven't eaten food, but I'm not going to collapse from a loss of strength in the way that I would if I'm lifting a heavy weight, where I would fail to be able to lift a heavy weight. Similar for walking. So at a low level of effort, we're using muscle fibers that don't produce a lot of force, that aren't capable of it, but also aren't capable of generating the responses we're going after. And then there's a whole range where at the other end of that range, there are muscle fibers that can produce a tremendous amount of force, but can't do it for very long. And as you work towards that end of the range, those muscle fibers fatigue fairly rapidly, and they don't recover very quickly. They take longer to recover strength gradually and a lot longer to recover the strength fully. And those are the muscle fibers that tend to stimulate the responses we're going after and that can improve in strength. Those are what really decline in strength, that we lose over time in the age-related loss of strength called sarcopenia. So there's a big importance, I think, in targeting that portion of the muscle fibers. And when we're training, that has implications for if we're doing something that's at a low level of exertion and we're getting generally tired from getting warm and just using lots of energy over time, that's not going to be the same thing from a higher level of intensity. From conversations I've had with muscle physiologists that I trust to be on top of the current understanding of these issues, I think there's a good rule of thumb that, at least given what we know right now, if a muscle is working at a level of effort that it cannot sustain beyond around 90 seconds to 3 minutes, somewhere within that time it's working at 100% and you're no longer able to continue doing the task that you've been doing, then that's going to have a good shot of getting the largest number of those muscle fibers in that category that we're trying to target. And then we use the term muscle failure to talk about that event where you stop being able to continue in the activity you've been doing. Now, if you're doing that, what I just described, if you're finding a way to use activity to accomplish that, that's something that's extremely taxing and that you're not going to do every day. It's too much to do every day. So we have to start to make trade-offs and see we can push our intensity very high, but that's going to compromise the volume of work that we do, and it's also going to compromise how often we can do it. And we have to choose how are we trying to pick and choose between those variables. So intensity is an interesting topic, and I'm going to right now leave it as basically the level of effort you're putting forth. But I think it has various parameters that can be emphasized and de-emphasized, and it can have different shapes of intensity. And if you want me to talk more to that, ask me in the Q&A, and I'll give you more about that. So I want you to try a thought experiment now. So imagine you're watching a person, imagine you walk into a gym and you're watching all the people in the gym working out, and you have a special form of X-ray vision that lets you see into their muscle tissues, and it makes their muscles glow red to the extent that they're exerting effort. And so you see people who are jogging on treadmills, you see people who are lifting and lowering weights, and you see these probably flashes and intermittent red lights glowing in various parts of their bodies because you can see that happening. And if we think of intensity as being in part the rate at which we're challenging and tiring out the muscles, you can see that a lot of what people are doing is a long way from a constant amount of effort that you might think would be a little more intense. So that's something that you can take to exercise, ways that you're approaching exercise and specific exercises you're doing, and see if you could see your own muscles, are you doing things that are giving it intermittent rest where that glowing red is turning off? And is that really what you want to be doing? So imagine now I'm doing a bicep curl here, and I've got a barbell in my arms, and I'm going to be lifting and lowering that barbell. So one thing we can look at is the effect of speed of movement. So if I think I'm going to try to get 10 repetitions out, and I just start going like this, and I start moving really fast, and I'm counting the reps, and I'm excited that I'm getting close. Can you now imagine what you're seeing in my arms? During this part, I'm dropping the bar. Is there any red light going on up there? No. Once I start moving, there's a lot, but then there's momentum taking over. So through about half of the range on the way up, there's very little. I'm probably pausing for a moment up here where there's very little. I'm probably pausing for a moment down there where there's very little. And so you can start to use that insight you have. Now, imagine I do this. Imagine I get a weight that feels challenging as I start to move it slowly, and I just keep slowly moving that up. And when I get to the point where I could change my body and let myself rest, I don't. I get near that point and I turn around. And I actively resist that weight on the way down. And then slowly start lifting again. Can you see how there might be a difference there? And I recommend you try that out and really feel the difference. If you haven't tried that before, most people just have no idea how much difference that makes on the intensity your body's experiencing and on the exercise effects that it generates. So I think I want to do another quick volunteer. I need 3 people who are willing to come up to the stage. Great, there's 2 on the row right here, 1 in back right there. Yep, come on up. Come on up. Come on up. Oh, we got 4. You can hang out. We're good to go.
Hi.
Hi, Chad.
David.
Yeah.
Rob.
Hi, Rob. Chad.
Kevin.
Hi, Kevin. Chad. So, who here has done a wall sit before?
What's that?
Okay, I've got what I need.
Oh.
So, because I need 2 wall sitters, and have you ever gone jogging before?
Yes.
All right. So what I'm going to ask you to do is just jog around the stage.
Okay.
Not too hard, not too fast, but make loops, circles, zigzags, whatever. And then I want you guys to come over, and I'm going to have each of you do a wall sit against this podium on either side, and I'm going to hold this. If you can go at the same time, that'll help, but we won't let this thing tip over. So right now, yep, go ahead, get into a wall sit position there, and go ahead and start to jog.
Okay.
And you can jog. If you can do it up here so people can see you, or people can probably imagine what your legs are doing.
So stay up here?
So stay up here, yep. So we're about 15 seconds into everybody doing this. And I want you to start noticing, I want you to ask a few questions, actually. So is it clear that anyone on the stage now is putting more intensity on their muscle tissues? Who do you think is fatiguing their muscles at a faster rate? Who do you think is going to have to start recruiting their strongest muscle fibers pretty soon? Who do you think is challenging their cardiorespiratory system more? I'll ask these guys here. Is your cardiorespiratory system being challenged at all? No? If we give this another half an hour, these guys are going to be panting and dying for air, and we're going to have about the same situation happening here. So drop a little lower toward the floor, yeah? Drop a little lower, bring your back up against the wall here, and pretty soon we'll start to see heart rate. If we had heart rate monitors on these guys, we'd see a big difference within a couple minutes of where the heart rate's going. And which activity do you think has a better safety profile? Yeah. How much longer should we? Well, let me ask you another question. I've got another one. Who's doing more? So that's an interesting question, right? Because is your heart rate coming up at all yet? Haven't breathe a little bit more? Yeah. Yep. All right. So go ahead and we'll let everybody down here. I got it. Thank you very much. Yep, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That's good. Well done.
Now, there's some there's some nuance too, to even within, somebody's doing what we call a wall sit here. If somebody's particularly strong and they've got a lot of friction, they can let themselves hover right at the minimum effort and just hold on to that and be really skilled at that activity, like we can be skilled at any sport. But there's also a way to, if you can produce friction, get it so you're pushing up, like you're trying to stand up, as hard as you can for the whole time. And that's going to cause even more effect. So there are ways, even once we've selected a general category of trying to challenge our muscles, there are all kinds of ways we can fine-tune that to add to the amount of muscular effort that's happening. But it's an interesting question because a lot of people will say, I need to do more exercise. I feel like I'm out of shape, I need to do more exercise. So notice, I think everyone that I saw when I asked who was doing more pointed to an interesting area on the stage. And it's not where the average person would point to if they said, I need to do more. They would look at the external measurement of how much movement is happening. So it's valuable, very valuable, I think, to try to translate any movement that's happening in an activity into what's happening within the muscles during that time. And you can get a lot of mileage out of that. And we can argue over what are exactly the right parameters, but regardless of what those are, we have to translate into those parameters to be able to adjust and optimize for them. All right, next principle, recovery. So the event of activity is one part of exercise, but all of the benefits happen not during the activity, but after, while we're recovering. The activity is momentarily tiring us out, making us weaker, causing micro-trauma in the muscle fibers if we're really doing a lot. And after that, our bodies respond and work to grow stronger. And different people and at different ages will respond at different rates. So you could have people doing the same activities, getting different responses. But what we want to do is maximize the response for an individual. And for any response to happen, we have to rest a certain amount, and we have to recover. And again, there's going to be a range of how recovery works for different individuals, but it's always going to be proportional to the intensity of effort. And recovery is basically just not exerting intense effort. There's a huge multi-billion-dollar industry now of recovery aids, of supplements, of devices, of massages, all kinds of things you can spend money on that are supposed to help your recovery. I find that very unconvincing in almost every case. There's a fascinating book that just came out called Good to Go, if anyone's interested, that explores the recovery industry and the claims that are being made and just how difficult it is to get evidence on that. So I recommend that to anyone who's interested. But my perspective is just not doing high intensity effort for however long you need to, a few days, a couple days, that's your recovery. Exercise selection. So some principles about this. I tend to put any activity through a filter of highest benefits. So I ask, can I use the activity in question to bring a muscle to failure in less than 3 minutes or so, and do it in a way that minimizes injury risk? So now if we start thinking about activities, does walking or running fit into that? Does yoga or Pilates fit into that? Does standing on a vibrating plate fit into that? Can lifting weights fit into that? And there may be degrees of fitting into that. But I think that's an interesting filter for activity. And not that there isn't great value to an activity that doesn't fit that, but it may not be the highest value exercise activity. So if all else is equal when I'm selecting an exercise, I want to work more muscles simultaneously rather than fewer, rather than doing lots of little exercises that isolate a muscle. working more muscle tissue altogether, you're going to feel it has a much greater fatiguing effect. And there's evidence that that produces more benefits. And it's much more efficient to do one exercise covering a third of your body than 5 exercises to cover the same third. You want to eliminate significant wear and tear on the joints over time. Again, all else equal. So the way you approach the exercise, moving slower, can be one way to do that, but also selection is important. The ability to adjust the level of challenge so that you can build up your skill level at a level of challenge and exertion that fits for you. And does it allow you to safely target your level of effort that you're going for? So if you're shooting for 100%, which is often my goal, at all-out effort, things tend to become a little bit unstable. You might be involving multiple muscles. Some of those muscles might start to fatigue before others. And is that going to put you in a position of instability where you're not going to be able to really push hard at 100%? And if that's what you want to do, that's a consideration for what kinds of movements you select. Quick principle of diminishing returns. So if you're able to achieve a high level of intensity that's fatiguing the strongest fibers, that's a big deal. And time and effort put beyond that for the average person, I think often comes at the expense of actually doing that well. So I recommend, especially if you're just a regular person wanting to get some exercise in, get really good at that 20% that yields the probably 80% of benefits you're going to get before you ever think about trying to do 100% of what's possible. And I see people get just much, much more mileage out of this. So that's my recommendation on diminishing returns. All right, pitfalls. The trap of comparing to others. So this is tempting, but dangerous. There's huge variation in how much our bodies are capable of responding to exercise. And super responders may get all the results possible to them doing some of the least effective things to people in general. And the people who are genetically gifted in that way tend to be vastly overconfident in their general knowledge of fitness and how it applies to other people. So if you know somebody who's in amazing shape, maybe try what they recommend and compare it to something like I'm describing if it's vastly different, and actually see for you what works better. Because I think the trend in the research data shows a certain trend, a certain thing. The calorie burning trap. So the calories you burn during exercise don't result in a net calorie loss over time, almost ever. And there's a lot of literature on this, and most people have personally experienced this, yet it's easy to fall prey to this. So the total calories you burn during a workout also don't tell you anything about the all-important intensity of your workout. If you're optimizing for intensity, your workouts will be shorter and less frequent, and you won't be able to burn nearly as many calories as if you're lowering your intensity and optimizing for calories. So really optimizing for maximum calorie burning is inherently optimizing against intensity. So just know you're making a choice there if you're focusing on calorie burning, and know what that choice is that you're making. The performance trap, and I already alluded to this. There's a difference between training for performance and training as exercise, and it's easy to fall into the performance trap during exercise with respect to how much weight can I lift, how many repetitions can I do, how long can I go for, and what I see is any of those, if they're held as the goal, you'll find ways to achieve those by degrading the intensity of your workout. So again, know that focusing on those can be helpful within a context, but if that's the ultimate goal, it's going to work against intensity, and it's going to work against safety. All right, the fun trap. We tend to enjoy what we're good at. And the way to find out if intense efforts are gratifying or even fun is to first get good at them, not to evaluate how fun it is when you're bad at it. But also, really hard work is almost never going to feel fun like a recreational activity. There's a small number of people who really enjoy it, but to most, no. You want to think of using the exercise benefits to make your recreation more fun, not insisting that exercise be super fun. The variety trap. So there's a lot to be said for mastery over variety, and you really largely have to pick one or the other. You can get really, really skilled with exercise, and you can get more and more intensity out of them on a time scale of years. And you can mix up your routine, and that's your overall intensity. And if you look at, again, the level of what's happening within the muscle fibers, there's a lot that you're missing out on and maybe a little that you're gaining, but it's a real trade-off. So it's not obvious that variety is benefit, and it's easy to delude ourselves and rationalize that we need variety because we just want it to be a little easier or we want it to be a little more fun. So we want to look at where are the actual benefits, I think. The stable baseline trap. So I think this is maybe one of the most important points I have to make. When we're children and teenagers and we're first exposed to the idea of exercise, our baseline strength and stamina are generally increasing. And the value of exercise is going to cause those to rise faster. And we tend to get stuck in the mindset that we have this stable baseline, and our choice is to try to increase it or just to keep going with it. But if we look in the scale of a lifetime, that's totally wrong. Once we're into our mid-20s, mid-30s or so, our baseline can start falling in various ways, in various dimensions. And that's what's going to happen for the rest of our life. So at the end, we're all going to die. And on the way there, we're going to be going downhill to some extent, if we live long enough. Think about anyone you know in their 80s or 90s. Are they really performing at a higher level than they could have in their 20s? I mean, this is universal. It's just a fact. And the statistics I've heard is that if we make it to our 40s, 70 to 80% of us are going to die of either heart disease, stroke, cancer, or dementia. Those are all things that exercise has been shown to improve. They're not going to make those go away, but they may push them down the road a little bit further, which is valuable in and of itself. But there's another point. On the way there, again, if we live long enough, our bodies are going to start to fail first. The medical term for this is sarcopenia. And this is a really big deal. This is the age-related loss of strength and function that interferes dramatically with quality of life. And we can reliably use exercise to slow our rate of decline as we age and maintain a higher level of physical functioning for much longer. So another catastrophic event that can happen is, and it happens with some frequency, is a hip fracture with a fall that just leads to a downward spiral, and that's it. Again, exercise can both increase strength and aspects of balance and also bone density. So valuable for, again, not eliminating that, but maybe pushing it further down the road. And at any point, if we can find a way to exercise better, that can level up our baseline, as the video game people say. So you've got this baseline going along that's declining. At any point, when you're 99, you start training, that will reliably bring that up a level. But the earlier we do that, probably the better. And a couple of concepts and points to think about with respect to that are silent deterioration and physiological headroom. So when we're exercising near our limits, we'll notice at a certain point we're not improving much more or at all more. And that can feel discouraging, and it might feel like, yeah, I'm not improving more, I'm going to give up on this. But then if we stop, we're no longer going to notice where our limit is, and our limit's going to be falling a lot faster than if we were training. And we're not going to notice where our limit is until it falls to the point that it's interfering with things we want to be doing. And it's probably fallen a lot by that time. Physiological headroom is the idea of how high our limits are above what we want to do every day. So one way to think of exercise is to give us as much headroom as we can when we're operating, so that over time, that's not going to fall as low as fast. And if we have a sudden catastrophic health issue, and maybe not catastrophic, but bad health issue, we're going to be able to recover from it better. Okay, quick points on application. So I like to think of having a hierarchy of exercise investments. And for myself personally, my level 1 of that is very simple. It's to once a week experience 100% effort by all the largest muscles in my body, using as few exercises as possible, transitioning between those exercises as fast as possible to have as much cardiorespiratory effect as I can, and having that challenging effort be for around 90 to 100 seconds, where the last 10 seconds of that is all-out effort, and that takes me personally about 6 to 10 minutes a week. And that's kind of the base of my hierarchy. That's my non-negotiable, what I want to be getting done. That's been my base for over 20 years. And I like how that functions. So I whatever else I might want to do, experiment, have fun with, that's a base level. And I'm going to leave it at that, because I think that's valuable enough to just leave that there by itself. If you want to ask me about more, you can. Getting started. So if you're not exercising currently, context matters a lot. Where are your physical limitations? Start with simple exercises. Work up gradually. Don't try to be really intense really fast. Make sure your skill is there all the way along. Ongoing practice. Have a way to consistently exercise and remind yourself over time, whether it's a calendar, a friend that you work out with, a personal trainer that you hire, whatever you need to do to get that baseline commitment done consistently. And have a thought-out personal baseline. So think about your long-term perspective. Ask what's important to you. Ask what's practical. What can you actually do? For an example, 1 day a week, 3 exercises. I think that's a worthwhile baseline. Most people would say, oh, that's not worth it. I think that's worth a lot. And it's also true if you're an athlete, because you can be training a whole lot for a sport, but then if an injury comes up, do you have a baseline to fall back on? Or do you just quit completely for months? And then measuring ROI on your activities. So you've got a portfolio of whatever activities you do regularly. I think of this as an investment of your time, your effort, your money. And long term, remember the big ROI is how do you do against the expected decline? So it's nice to bump that baseline up, but also look over time, are you optimizing things to minimize that decline and really push things down the road at a high level as far as you can? So my main takeaway points in conclusion are: 1, optimize for the degree of challenge and effort and not for performance. And at the limit, you'll always face a trade-off between those two. 2, optimize for safety and always be asking, can I produce the same intensity and benefits with a better safety profile? Number 3, minimize your long-term decline. Keep in mind, that's important, and it's something you can really impact. And number 4, the minimum effective dose for this isn't that high. So given how intensity drives so many exercise benefits, I think it's reasonable to expect significant benefits, and I have seen this for 20 years with clients at my gym. We're doing just once or twice a week, as little as 10 to 20 minutes each workout. It's a very efficacious minimum effective dose. So I'll move on to questions and answers.
Hi.
Go, yeah.
First, I apologize if I ask something you covered, because running back to the lecture, I missed the first 15 minutes. Is there any reading that you recommend that covers some of, or website, some of what you said? Specifically, somebody that work out a lot, but I think I can be more efficient. I mean, I run a lot, I cycle a lot, I do some weights, but I realize that I might be neglecting some intensity, as you mentioned, muscles group.
Yeah.
What do you recommend reading?
If your goal is to bring intensity to
No, the goal
your
is to
strength training,
long-term.
Yeah, to add
low
that.
decline.
In terms of specific discussion of exercises and how to approach them, I think there's a good basic discussion of that in a book called Body by Science, and one of the authors is Doug McGuff, McGuff. Body by Science. Mm-hmm. And that will give several examples of exercises and how to approach them in a way to optimize for intensity and for a lot that I've been talking about. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You validated all that I've learned, and this talk has been way better than I expected. Regarding, you said you'd talk more about intensity parameters, obviously for seniors, and I am in the stage where I am seeing the decline, and I'm finding that I do the intensity, whereas I used to, like you said, do it sets. And now I'll do a set and then do something to calm down and wait, and then I'll come back later and do another set so that I can still do them. And I'm wondering, should I just, and I've already done less sets, I've cut that down.
Yeah.
You know, how do you, how much do you?
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions embedded in that. One thing is, if you're taking the parameters I was talking about, where you're extending your effort, and it's effort the whole time for 90, 120, 180 seconds, and you're ending up at a point where you're exhausted and going all out, doing another set isn't going to be that productive. And you've spent more time and effort working your muscles than 3 sets. So an average set at the gym, if you watch people, is around 36 seconds from me standing in the corner timing them. And a lot of that time, as we see with the flickering lights, they're not really working. So if you're moving in a way that you're going slow and working the whole time, and you're going 2 minutes, you're spending a lot more time, real-time metabolic effort than those people are, and you're going to experience that you don't need to do a second set, in my opinion. And then the more, and it feels tough to move quickly to the next exercise, but if you can push that, you're going to start pushing your cardiorespiratory system much more, and your body will acclimate to that. You will benefit from that, and you will improve your ability to do that. So I recommend that rather than settling back and saying, oh, I want to rest more time so I get full effort, experiment with pushing that a little bit faster. I actually time sometimes that distance between stopping one exercise and starting the next one for myself and for my clients who are game for that. And the difference between 2 to 3 minutes, which seems pretty fast if you're grabbing a drink of water and getting on the next exercise, and 1 minute is like night and day. The difference between a minute and 45 seconds is night and day. 45 to 20, 20 to 15. I can get some of them down to 10 seconds myself, and that just feels blindingly fast, and it doesn't seem to degrade the performance nearly as much as you'd think, especially your body will acclimate to it. So I think there's value in pushing that. Sure.
I'm interested in what you had to say at the beginning of your talk. You said something about training for muscle size, not necessarily leading to optimal results.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's something to be said for training for muscle size when you're young as kind of an investment in your future health to put off ailments like sarcopenia.
So it's a tricky thing. A lot of the research in exercise physiology is how do we drive muscle size, and to a good extent, the cross-sectional area of a muscle will be proportional to its strength. But different people will seem to express greater size increases than others. And a lot of times, I've trained some people with enormous muscles who are not nearly as strong as people with much smaller muscles. So it's very interesting, and some people will get much, much stronger and not express a great deal of size increase. Now, if we think of this evolutionarily, like one of the big impediments to performance, if we need to exert a lot of activity to get away from a predator or to functionally, build our house, do whatever chores we need to do, maybe the biggest impediment to extended performance is overheating. And overheating is dramatically affected by the surface area ratio to the volume of the body. So if your muscles can perform at a higher level and maintain a lower surface area on your body and be smaller, that's a big advantage. And it's one I think we evolutionarily would want. It's a there are known genetic defects that are present in people who are able to express large amounts of muscle size like bodybuilders. And I think it makes sense why we have genes that limit. So if for other reasons your body just isn't able to increase strength and it has to make much more size than normal, that's a trade-off. You want to get as much muscle as you can. You can't choose the body you have, but if you could, I think you'd want to choose a body that doesn't look like a pro bodybuilder. But if that's what you have, you maximize it and go with it, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Do you have any advice on dealing with plateauing?
Well, at a certain point, you're going to hit an upper limit. And again, my advice is to be conscious of the long-term consequences of giving up at that point and saying, well, I can't get higher, so I won't do anything. But a plateau over time, and a graph I often draw for people is a line where they think their baseline is, and then say, look, your actual baseline is going to move like this over time. If you're feeling like you're plateaued and you tilt that up to looking at your line compared to where your baseline is actually headed, you're doing an upward trajectory over a long period of time. Like compared to your actual baseline in future, a plateau is an upward trend. So keep that in mind. But outside of that, yeah, you can experiment with higher levels of intensity. You can experiment with longer rest intervals. You can experiment with different exercises to generate that intensity. But one thing that a lot of people never experiment with is longer recovery times between efforts if they're at high intensity. So that would be a first thing to test and see what happens. I was blown away when I found out that all-out effort, if I train more often than once every 5 days with the same muscle, I actually trend down. If I go once every 5 days with the same muscles, or 6 or 7 or 8, I trend up.
Thank you.
I found that when I was 19, it blew me away. Okay, next person.
Hi, this was of great interest to me. My daughter, who's an objectivist, is a celebrity yoga teacher in New York City, and now everybody can see her on the Peloton app. Mm-hmm. But the reason I brought this up is her motto is, you're only as old as you are flexible. Mm-hmm. And she keeps telling all of her clients, one of her clients is a famous comedian we all know, who his Pratt's, he has to fall all the time, has yoga with her about twice a week just to stay flexible. And so I'd like your comment on that.
Well, think about what happens to people as they get older. Think about the ways in which we lose quality of life. Is it all flexibility? I don't know. I think there's a lot that's strength. So I think losing flexibility is an interesting thing. I see flexibility improve from healthier muscle tissues all the time. I see injuries. Yoga and running are two of the most injury-prone activities that are out there. If you look up the statistics, not that you can't do them correctly without injury, but the danger level on those, for myself, I consider pretty high, the chronic kinds of things that can arise. So, for me, that's a factor. And I think it is true that we lose flexibility, and that's a problem. But I think are people doing yoga in a way that's minimizing their long-term risk? Are they better off doing something like, I think Alexander technique and Feldenkrais technique are really fascinating ways to improve mobility and patterns of muscle use and some flexibility issues. So it's a whole area that's, it's not my specialty, but I'm very suspicious of calling flexibility the ultimate gauge of someone's physical well-being. Okay, next.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. So a few years ago, I started doing strength training consistently, and my main drivers back then were physical health and aesthetics. But what I realized shortly afterwards, which has become very important to me as well, were the mental benefits derived from physical exercise. And whenever I'm having a bad day, it helps me calm down, makes me feel happier, and I feel that's also a very important part of exercise. So I'd like to hear your comment on that.
Well, it's a valuable benefit of physical activity, for sure. Now, if exercise is the deliberate engagement in physical activity to produce physical improvements over time, then, or whether we call that exercise or not, that is an important thing to me. And that doesn't include those mental benefits. But I find that my favorite hour of the week is the hour right after I do an all-out intense workout. Like, it's the best activity for me to get those benefits. Or if I do two 20-second sprints of high-intensity interval training, similar thing. So also, in improving the fundamental strength and stamina of your body is going to enhance your capacity to do and enjoy any activity that produces that effect, whether it's swimming, hiking, jogging, running, whatever those other things are. You're going to potentially improve your ability, your enjoyment, your robustness and resilience from injury in those activities. So I think that's a big consideration, is that exercise, as I'm defining it and describing it here, is going to add value to those other activities, not that it's the sole way to get at that, or to get at those benefits. And some people might get equal or more of those benefits meditating. So I don't think those benefits are, or any number of things, drawing. So those aren't the sole domain of physical activity. All right, last question.
I have two, but I'll go fast. I was first off wondering what your opinion was on the difference between like fluid motion rather than back and forth reps. Because my coach talked to me a good bit about that, and she said that the best way to build up practical muscle, or practical for me, because I do aerial arts and my sport is performance athletics based. What's your opinion on that, and just to do with exercise, not performance?
Describe the distinction a little bit more.
Like, instead of just doing back and forth using the same muscles over and over again for a rep, or lifting weights or something, you kind of switch and do fluid motions, so you switch which muscles you're using while still engaging all of them, so you just kind of exercise the switch between different muscles.
Yeah, so what you're doing there is you're describing learning a skill of an activity. And I think it's pretty clear in the research at this point that if you're trying to optimize for strength, you look at, well, if you look at the muscle fiber that I talked about, its function, it can do one, maybe two things depending on how you look at it. So the muscle fiber is these units of sarcomeres that's with filaments that slide up, and these are stacked end to end, maybe 100,000 or two. And when they do that, the whole thing shortens. And it's a simple, like the ones and zeros, it can shorten. And then when something pushes it the other way, it can actively resist getting longer. Those are the things that your muscles do. And if you take the muscles out of your body and you lay them all on a table and you hook them up to electrodes, they get shorter or they get pulled out longer. That's it. That's all they do. They don't do complex movements. We make those complex movements out of learning different patterns. So if we want to stimulate, the question is, how do we want to improve the strength in those muscles? So it looks like there's value in maintaining effort in that same muscle over time, and, if possible, incorporating both the concentric, where the muscle is shortening element, and especially the eccentric, where it's fighting the act of being lengthened, and it's working really hard to fight that as you get tired. So from a standpoint of just improving the strength of the individual muscles, I don't think that, I think But there are other values to performance of learning those. So I think those are kind of separate tracks. And any athlete wants to ask how much do they want to work to best they can isolate the strength improvements so they have more strength going into their skill practices. So I think those are two separate
And then
arenas.
second question is a bit faster, but it's kind of,
I'm being told we don't have time for a second question. I'm being cut off, so come ask me later. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.